"Mom, you're too old to be handling assets. I'm going to sell everything and put the money someplace safe." I swallowed hard and didn't say a word. But that night, when he opened my drawer, he let out a desperate scream. He couldn't believe what he found inside. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, about 3:30, and I had just finished serving that pot roast he'd been asking me to make for months. The same recipe I'd perfected over 23 years, with carrots slow-cooked until they melted in your mouth, and that rich gravy that takes me 4 hours to get just right. My daughter-in-law, Ashley, was sitting right there next to him, cutting her meat with this smug little smile on her face, like she was watching her favorite TV show. She didn't even try to hide it. Her perfectly manicured nails, the ones I probably paid for with all those emergency loans they keep asking for, were tapping against her wine glass. My wine glass, filled with wine from my kitchen, in my home. I felt that piece of pot roast stick in my throat like concrete. My hands started shaking so bad I had to put my fork down. 28 years I'd lived in this condo. 28 years of working double shifts as a seamstress, saving every penny, building something solid for my family. And now my own son, my 36-year-old son, who still can't balance his own checkbook, was telling me I was too old to handle my own money. "What do you mean by that, Daniel?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The air conditioning was humming in the background, but suddenly the room felt stifling hot. Daniel barely looked at me when he answered. He just kept cutting his meat, avoiding eye contact like he used to do when he was 12 and had broken something. "Mom, you're 68 years old. You live alone. Anything could happen to you. It's better if I handle the finances from now on. Actually, I already scheduled a real estate agent to come look at the place on Wednesday. We need to think about getting you somewhere more appropriate." Appropriate. That word hit me like a slap across the face. Ashley jumped in then, dabbing her mouth with my good linen napkin, the set I'd bought for special occasions. "Margaret, sweetheart, it's really for your own good. We'll take such good care of everything. You won't have to worry about bills or maintenance or any of that stressful stuff anymore." Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of fake sweetness you use when you're talking to a child you think is too stupid to understand what's really happening. I just sat there, staring at these two people eating food I'd prepared with my own hands, in the home I'd worked myself half to death to buy, while they calmly discussed stealing my entire life from under me. The smell of the roast that had filled me with such pride just minutes before now made my stomach turn. My mind was spinning. Was this really happening? Was my own son, the boy I'd raised by myself after his father walked out, actually sitting at my table planning to rob me? Daniel kept talking, his voice getting more confident as he warmed up to his speech, like he'd practiced this. "We've already looked into some really nice assisted living places. There's this one in Homestead that's only about $2,000 a month. Much more reasonable than trying to maintain this big place all by yourself. $2,000. I'd done the math in my head before he even finished the sentence. My mortgage was paid off years ago. My maintenance fees were $640 a month. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, my total monthly expenses for this condo were less than $1,300. And he wanted to put me somewhere that would cost $2,000, plus whatever they'd charge for meals and care I didn't need. And Mom," Ashley added, reaching across the table to pat my hand like I was a confused old woman, "you'll make so many friends there, people your own age. You won't be so isolated." Isolated. I volunteer at St. Catherine's every Tuesday. I have book club with the ladies on Thursday mornings. Mrs. Rodriguez next door and I share coffee and gossip 3 times a week. I know every person in my building, from the security guard Carlos to the cleaning lady Maria, who always asks about my arthritis. But somehow, in Ashley's mind, I was isolated. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw a stranger. This wasn't the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. This wasn't the teenager who'd cried in my arms when his girlfriend broke up with him. This was a man with cold, calculating eyes who'd figured out that his elderly mother was his meal ticket to a better life. "I need to think about this," I managed to say, though thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw them both out of my house and tell them never to come back. But something deep in my gut told me to be careful, to play along until I could figure out exactly what they were planning. Daniel's face relaxed into what I'm sure he thought was a reassuring smile. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. But the real estate agent is coming Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Her name is Sandra Mitchell, and she comes very highly recommended." The rest of that dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation about Ashley's latest freelance project and Daniel's complaints about his job. But I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about that Wednesday appointment, about how confident they both seemed, about the way they'd clearly discussed this whole plan without including me in a single conversation about my own future. When they finally left around 6 o'clock, each giving me those fake kisses on the cheek and promising to check on me soon, I stood in my doorway watching them walk down the hallway toward the elevator. Ashley was already on her phone, and I caught just enough of her conversation to hear her say something about "went better than expected" and "she's not going to be a problem." I closed my door, turned the deadbolt, and leaned against it. My legs felt like jelly. My whole body was shaking. In the space of one Sunday afternoon, my son had just told me he was planning to sell my home and warehouse me in some facility while he took control of everything I'd worked for. But what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't even imagine in that moment, was that this conversation at my dinner table was just the beginning. What I discovered over the next few weeks about my son and daughter-in-law's real plan would make this Sunday afternoon look like a friendly chat. What would you do if you found out your own child was planning to steal everything you'd worked your whole life for? Leave a comment and let me know, because I'm about to tell you exactly what this 68-year-old woman did when she discovered the truth. And trust me, they never saw it coming. Let me go back a little and tell you how I got here, because you need to understand the whole story to believe what happened next. If you think what I just told you is bad, wait until you hear what I found out they were really planning to do with my money once they got their hands on it. My name is Margaret Elizabeth Santos, and for 68 years, I've been fighting for everything I have. I wasn't born into money. I wasn't handed anything on a silver platter. Every single thing in my life, this condo, my savings account, my independence, I earned with my own 2 hands, one stitch at a time. I started working when I was 15 years old, lying about my age to get a job at Martinez Alterations on Calle Ocho in Little Havana. Senora Martinez knew I was lying, but she also knew I needed the work. My father had walked out when I was 12, leaving my mother Rosa with 4 kids and no money. I was the oldest, so I became the breadwinner while she cleaned houses and tried to keep food on the table. For 41 years, I worked as a seamstress. 41 years of bending over sewing machines, of pricking my fingers with pins, of squinting at tiny stitches until my eyes watered. I hemmed wedding dresses for brides whose monthly clothing budget was more than I made in 6 months. I tailored suits for businessmen who barely acknowledged my existence. I fixed torn clothes for families who couldn't afford to buy new ones, just like I couldn't afford new ones when I was growing up. When I was 26, I met Roberto Santos at a church picnic. He was working as a delivery driver for a furniture company, saving up to buy his own truck and start a small moving business. We got married 8 months later in a tiny ceremony at St. John Bosco, with a reception in my mother's backyard and a cake I made myself because we couldn't afford a bakery. Daniel was born 2 years later, in March of 1987. Roberto and I were living in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Hialeah, with walls so thin you could hear every conversation the neighbors had. When Daniel was born, I had to go back to work when he was 6 weeks old because we couldn't survive on Roberto's income alone. I'd drop him off at my mother's house at 6 in the morning, work until 4, pick him up, and then come home to cook dinner and do the household chores while Roberto watched TV or hung out with his friends. I loved Roberto, but he was never what you'd call ambitious. He was content with just getting by, just making enough to pay the bills and have a few beers on the weekend. He'd talk about expanding his business, about buying a second truck, about all the things he was going to do next year. But next year never came. There was always some excuse, some reason why it wasn't the right time. When Daniel was 8, I made a decision that changed our lives. I was working at this upscale alteration shop in Coral Gables, and I noticed how much money these wealthy women spent on their clothes without thinking twice about it. One day, this lady brought in a designer dress that just needed the hem shortened, a 10-minute job, and she paid me $85 without blinking. That's when I realized I was working for the wrong people. I started taking on private clients. Rich ladies from Coral Gables and Coconut Grove who wanted their expensive clothes altered perfectly and were willing to pay premium prices for quality work. I'd work my regular job during the day, then come home and work on private alterations until midnight. Roberto complained that I was never around, that I was always working, but he didn't complain about the extra money when it meant he could buy a newer truck. By the time Daniel was 16, I had saved enough money for a down payment on this condo. It wasn't fancy back then, just a basic 2-bedroom unit with outdated appliances and carpet that had seen better days. But it was ours. Or rather, it was mine, since I was the one making the mortgage payments while Roberto's business barely broke even. Daniel was a smart kid, but he was also spoiled. Looking back now, I can see that I gave him too much, tried to make up for all the things I didn't have when I was growing up. While other kids his age had part-time jobs, Daniel focused on his studies. While other families struggled to pay for college, I had already set aside money for his education. I wanted him to have opportunities I never had. He got his business degree from Florida International University. I paid every penny of his tuition, bought his textbooks, even gave him spending money so he wouldn't have to work while studying. I was so proud when he graduated. I thought I'd raised a son who would appreciate what hard work and sacrifice could achieve. Roberto had his heart attack when Daniel was 27. It happened on a Tuesday morning while he was loading furniture into his truck. By the time the paramedics got there, it was too late. The life insurance policy I'd insisted he maintain, despite his complaints about the monthly premiums, paid out $150,000. Combined with what I'd already saved, I suddenly found myself with more money than I'd ever imagined having. That's when the first red flags should have gone up, but I was too grieving and too trusting to notice them. Daniel suddenly became very interested in my finances. He'd come over for dinner and casually ask about my retirement plans, about whether I'd thought about investing Roberto's life insurance money, about how much this condo was worth now that the neighborhood had gotten more expensive. At first, I thought he was just being a caring son, looking out for his widowed mother. When he suggested I meet with a financial advisor, I figured it was good advice. When he offered to help me organize my important papers, I was grateful for his attention. When he started asking for small loans to help with his rent or car payments, I was happy to help my son get established in his career. But the requests for money became more frequent. $500 here, $800 there. Always with a promise to pay me back as soon as I get my next bonus. Or, once this big project at work pays off. Of course, the payback never happened. The excuses got more elaborate, but the bottom line was always the same. Daniel needed money, and I was the person he expected to provide it. Then he met Ashley. Ashley Martinez, and yes, she kept her maiden name because she said Santos sounded too ethnic for her marketing career, was everything I wasn't. Tall, blonde, perfectly groomed, with a college degree in digital marketing and big dreams about building her own social media empire. She was also 29 years old when she met my 33-year-old son, which should have been the first warning sign. The second warning sign was how quickly she moved in with him. They'd been dating for 3 months when Daniel announced they were getting a place together. An expensive 1-bedroom apartment in Brickell, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the bay, costing $2,800 a month. More than double what he'd been paying for his studio apartment in Kendall. Ashley thinks it's important to live somewhere that reflects our professional aspirations, Daniel told me when I questioned the wisdom of such an expensive place. Image matters in her industry. What I didn't know then was that Daniel was already struggling with his existing expenses. His job at the logistics company paid him $52,000 a year. Decent money, but not enough to support the lifestyle Ashley had in mind. Within 6 months of moving in together, they were asking me for help with their rent. "Just this once, Mom," Daniel promised. "Ashley's got this big client lined up, and once that contract comes through, we'll be fine." I wrote them a check for $3,000, then another one 2 months later, then another one after that. Always with the same promises about big clients and upcoming bonuses that never seemed to materialize. When they got married 3 years ago, I paid for the wedding reception. $8,000 for a party at the Biltmore Hotel that lasted 4 hours and fed 70 people I'd never met before. Ashley insisted it had to be elegant, that her family and friends expected a certain level of sophistication. Daniel went along with everything she wanted, even though he knew we couldn't afford it. That was the moment I should have realized what was happening. My son had married a woman who was more interested in appearances than reality, and he was so desperate to keep her happy that he'd sacrifice his own family's financial security to give her what she wanted. But I loved my son, and I wanted him to be happy. When they asked for help with the down payment on a new car because Ashley's old Honda wasn't professional enough for client meetings, I helped. When they needed money for Ashley's laptop and equipment for her home office, I helped. When they fell behind on credit card payments because Ashley had invested in an expensive online marketing course, I helped again. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly now. Every few months, there was a new crisis, a new emergency, a new opportunity that just required a little financial help from good old Mom. And like a fool, I kept writing checks, telling myself it was temporary, that they'd get back on their feet, that this was what family did for each other. But here's what really gets me angry. While I was working overtime to help them maintain their expensive lifestyle, they were living like they had money to burn. Ashley's Instagram was full of pictures from expensive restaurants, shopping trips to Aventura Mall, weekend getaways to the Keys. She had a different designer handbag every month and more shoes than a department store. Meanwhile, I was still shopping at Walmart, still driving my 15-year-old Toyota Camry, still mending my own clothes instead of buying new ones. I told myself it was okay because I was helping my son build a better life. What I didn't realize was that I was enabling two grown adults to live beyond their means while they figured out how to get their hands on everything I'd worked for. The first real warning sign that something was seriously wrong came about 8 months ago. I was at Daniel and Ashley's apartment for dinner, and I needed to use their bathroom. The door to their bedroom was open, and I couldn't help but notice the stack of bills on Ashley's dresser. Bills with red stamps on them. Past due notices. Final demand letters. When I came back to the kitchen, I casually mentioned that it looked like they had some mail piling up. Daniel's face went white, and Ashley quickly changed the subject to some story about a difficult client. But I could see the look they exchanged. The kind of look that passes between people who are sharing a secret. After that, I started paying closer attention. I noticed that Ashley's shopping trips became more frequent right after I'd given them money for emergencies. I noticed that Daniel seemed stressed all the time, constantly checking his phone, getting calls that made him leave the room to talk privately. I noticed that they'd stopped talking about Ashley's big client opportunities and started making vague comments about needing to think long-term about financial security. The final piece of the puzzle came together last month when I ran into Rosa Gutierrez at the grocery store. Rosa works in the accounting department at the same logistics company where Daniel has his job. After we chatted for a few minutes about her grandchildren, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "I was so sorry to hear about Daniel losing his position," she said, reaching for a bag of rice. "Budget cuts are so hard on families. I hope he finds something new soon." I stood there in aisle 7 of Publix, holding a box of cereal, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. Daniel had been unemployed for 2 months, and he hadn't said a word to me about it. All those recent requests for help with temporary cash flow problems suddenly made sense. They weren't temporary problems at all. They were permanent problems that were about to become my problems. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the signs I'd missed, all the red flags I'd ignored. My son and his wife were in serious financial trouble, and instead of being honest with me about it, they'd been lying while continuing to ask for money they knew they couldn't pay back. But what I found out next was so much worse than unemployment or credit card debt. What I discovered about their real plan for my future would make me question everything I thought I knew about my own son. After that horrible Sunday dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was happening. Daniel had seemed too confident, too prepared. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a plan that had been in the works for a while. So I decided to do what any smart woman would do. I started paying attention. The first thing I noticed was that Daniel had started showing up at my condo when I wasn't home. I'd given him a key years ago for emergencies, back when I trusted him completely. But now I was finding little signs that someone had been in my apartment. A drawer that wasn't quite closed all the way. Papers on my kitchen counter that weren't exactly where I'd left them. my mail stack rearranged in a way that didn't match my usual system. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Maybe I really was getting forgetful, like Daniel kept suggesting. But then I talked to Carlos, the security guard in our lobby. Carlos has worked here for 12 years, and he knows everyone in the building. When I casually asked if he'd seen Daniel around lately, he told me something that made my stomach drop. "Oh yes, Miss Margaret, your son has been coming by quite a bit, maybe 3-4 times a week for the past month or so. Always very polite, that boy. Sometimes he brings that real estate lady with him too." Real estate lady. The same Sandra Mitchell who was supposed to come for the appraisal on Wednesday. They'd already been showing her around my home behind my back. I thanked Carlos and went upstairs, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? How many times had strangers been walking through my private space, evaluating my belongings, planning my future without my knowledge? That Tuesday morning, I decided to test my suspicions. I told Daniel I was going to my book club at the library, like I did every Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. But instead of going to the library, I parked my car around the corner and walked back to sit in the little coffee shop across the street from my building. From there, I had a perfect view of the lobby entrance. At 11:15, Daniel's silver Honda pulled into the visitor parking. But he wasn't alone. Ashley was with him, and there was a third person, a woman in a navy blue business suit carrying a leather portfolio. The three of them walked into my building like they owned the place. I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, drinking cup after cup of coffee that tasted like battery acid, watching my own son and his wife give tours of my home to strangers. They came and went 3 times with different people. A young couple in their 30s, an older man who looked like he had serious money, a woman about my age who kept taking notes in a little notebook. When they finally left at 1:30, I waited another 20 minutes before going back upstairs. The apartment looked normal, but now I knew how to look for the signs. Daniel had been careful, but not careful enough. There were business cards tucked behind my refrigerator magnets. A small piece of paper with measurements written in Ashley's handwriting had fallen under the couch. Most telling of all, there was a faint smell of perfume in my bedroom, the kind of expensive perfume Ashley always wore. That's when I realized they weren't just planning to sell my condo. They were actively marketing it. I called the library and confirmed that my book club was still meeting as usual. Then I called Daniel. "Hi, Mom," he answered on the second ring, and I could hear Ashley talking in the background. "How was book club?" "Oh, it was wonderful," I lied smoothly. "We discussed that new novel about the woman who discovers her family's secrets. Very interesting story about people who aren't what they seem to be." There was a pause. "That's nice, Mom. Listen, I can't talk long. I'm in a meeting." "A meeting? I thought you were between projects right now." Another pause, longer this time. "Right, yeah, it's more like an interview, for a new position. I'll call you later, okay?" He hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, holding my phone, realizing that my son had just lied to me without missing a beat. He was getting good at it. Over the next week, I started my own investigation. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who has lived in the building even longer than I have. Elena Rodriguez is 72 years old, sharp as a tack, and doesn't miss anything that happens in our hallway. "Margaret, honey," she said when I asked if she'd noticed anything unusual. "I've been wondering when you were going to ask me about that. Your Daniel has been coming around quite a bit, always with different people. Last Thursday, I heard him telling some woman that you were getting confused about finances and that the family needed to step in before you made any big mistakes." Confused about finances. The same woman who had managed her own money for 50 years, who had never bounced a check or missed a payment, who had built a comfortable retirement through careful planning and hard work. Confused. "Did he say anything else?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Well," Elena lowered her voice, even though we were talking in her apartment, "I heard him mention something about you needing more appropriate care. That's when that blonde wife of his chimed in about how guilty they felt that you were living all alone." Guilty. Ashley felt guilty about me living alone in the home I loved, in the neighborhood where I had friends and a life and independence. How thoughtful of her to worry about my solitude while she planned to profit from my displacement. But Elena wasn't finished. "And Margaret, I have to tell you something else. Last week, I saw Ashley going through your mailbox downstairs. She had your son's key, and she was taking things out and putting them in her purse. I thought maybe you'd asked her to collect your mail, but it seemed strange. My mailbox. They'd been stealing my mail, bank statements, investment reports, Social Security correspondence, everything they needed to get a complete picture of my financial situation. No wonder Daniel had seemed so confident about my net worth during our Sunday dinner. He knew exactly what he was talking about because he'd been stealing the information for months. That afternoon, I drove to my bank, First National, where I'd been a customer for 18 years. I asked to speak with Janet Morrison, the branch manager who had helped me organize my finances after Roberto died. Mrs. Santos, Janet smiled warmly when she saw me. What a lovely surprise. What can I do for you today? Janet, I need to ask you something confidential. Has anyone been asking about my accounts? Anyone claiming to be family or saying they needed information for my care? Janet's expression grew serious. As a matter of fact, yes. About 3 weeks ago, a young man called, claiming to be your son. He said you'd been having some memory problems and that he needed to verify your account balance for tax purposes. Of course, I told him I couldn't discuss your accounts with anyone without your written authorization, but he was quite persistent. He even mentioned specific account numbers, which was concerning. Specific account numbers. From the statements they'd been stealing from my mailbox. Did he give you his name? Daniel Santos. And when I refused to give him any information, he became rather agitated. He said something about how banks needed to be more flexible with elderly customers who might not be able to advocate for themselves. Elderly customers who might not be able to advocate for themselves. As if I was some senile old woman who needed her brilliant son to manage her affairs. I thanked Janet and drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. This wasn't just about selling my condo anymore. They were building a case that I was incompetent, mentally declining, unable to handle my own affairs. They were systematically gathering evidence to support a narrative that would justify taking control of my entire life. But I still didn't know how deep this rabbit hole went. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister Patricia in Chicago. Patricia is 5 years older than me, retired from her job as a school principal, and has always been the practical one in our family. If anyone would know what to do in this situation, it would be her. Maggie, Patricia said after I'd told her the whole story, you need to protect yourself right now, today, this minute. What they're doing sounds like elder financial abuse, and if they're building a case that you're mentally incompetent, they might try to get legal guardianship over you. Legal guardianship. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard about cases like that. Adult children convincing courts that their elderly parents couldn't make decisions for themselves, then gaining complete control over their finances, their health care, their living situations. Once that happened, the elderly person essentially became a prisoner of their own family's greed. Patricia, what do I do? First, you document everything. Every conversation, every lie, every time they've been in your apartment without permission. Second, you change your locks immediately. Third, you move your money to a different bank, one they don't know about. And fourth, you get yourself a good attorney who specializes in elder law. I hung up the phone and sat in my living room, looking around at the home I'd worked so hard to create. My grandmother's doilies on the side tables, the family pictures covering one entire wall, the comfortable furniture I'd saved up to buy piece by piece over the years. They weren't just planning to sell my home. They were planning to take away my right to make decisions about my own life. The next morning, I called a locksmith. By noon, Daniel's key no longer worked in my door. And that afternoon, I got the phone call that confirmed my worst fears. Mrs. Santos, this is Sandra Mitchell from Prestigious Properties Real Estate. I understand there might have been some confusion about our appointment yesterday. Your son said you weren't feeling well, but I wanted to follow up directly with you about scheduling the property evaluation. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Ms. Mitchell, I never authorized any property evaluation. And my son has no legal right to schedule appointments regarding my home. There was a long pause. Oh my. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Santos. Your son told me that you'd asked him to handle the sale because you were, well, he said you were having some difficulties managing these kinds of transactions yourself. Ms. Mitchell, I am 68 years old, not 98. I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. If and when I decide to sell my home, I will contact a real estate agent myself. Another pause. Of course, I understand completely. And Mrs. Santos, I feel I should mention that your son put down a deposit to hold our services exclusively for 30 days. He was very insistent that the sale needed to happen quickly. A deposit. They'd already paid money to lock in a real estate agent for a house they didn't own. They weren't just planning this, they were actively executing it. After I hung up, I sat down at my kitchen table and made a list of everything I knew. Daniel had been unemployed for 2 months without telling me. They had massive debt they'd been hiding from me. They'd been stealing my mail to gather financial information. They'd been showing my apartment to potential buyers without my knowledge. They'd hired a real estate agent and put down a deposit. They'd been telling people I was mentally incompetent. They'd attempted to get information from my bank by pretending I was incapable of handling my own accounts. Looking at that list, written out in black and white, I realized that what I was dealing with wasn't just greed or desperation. This was a calculated, systematic plan to steal my entire life savings and convince everyone, including potentially a court, that I was too mentally impaired to stop them. But what I found out next would make all of these discoveries look like small change. Because while I was busy uncovering their plan to steal my condo and my money, they had been working on something much bigger, something that would have left me with absolutely nothing and nowhere to turn for help. The worst was yet to come, and when I found out what they'd really been planning for my future, I realized that that Sunday dinner conversation hadn't been the beginning of their scheme. It had been the end game of a plan that had been months in the making. What I discovered next would have destroyed most people, but I'm not most people. I'm a woman who survived growing up poor, who worked my fingers raw to build a life, who buried a husband and raised a son mostly alone. I've been knocked down before, and I've always gotten back up. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared me for what I found when I really started digging into Daniel and Ashley's plan. It started with Daniel's phone. 3 days after I changed my locks, Daniel showed up at my door around dinner time. He was agitated, sweaty, and clearly upset that his key didn't work anymore. "Mom, what the hell?" He was pounding on my door. "Why doesn't my key work? Are you okay in there?" I opened the door but left the security chain on. "I'm fine, Daniel. I just thought it was time to upgrade my security." "Upgrade your security?" "Mom, I'm your son. I need to be able to get in here in case of an emergency." "If there's an emergency, Daniel, you can call 911 like everyone else." He stood there for a moment, clearly trying to figure out his next move. "Can I come in? We need to talk about this real estate situation. There's been some confusion with the agent." I almost laughed. Confusion. That's what he was calling it. "Actually, Daniel, I'm not feeling very well tonight. Maybe we can talk tomorrow." "Mom, this is important. We can't afford to delay this process. The market conditions won't stay favorable forever." Market conditions. Like he was doing me some kind of favor by selling my home. I let him in, and that's when fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Daniel went to the bathroom, and in his hurry to get upstairs and argue with me about the locks, he'd left his phone on my kitchen counter. And just as I was walking past it, a text message popped up on the screen. It was from Ashley. "Did you tell her about Sunset Manor yet? The admissions lady called. They need the deposit by Friday, or we lose the spot." Sunset Manor. I stared at that text message, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. They'd already picked out a nursing home for me. They'd put me on a waiting list, spoken to admissions, and were ready to put down a deposit to warehouse me somewhere called Sunset Manor. My hands were shaking as I quickly took a picture of the text with my own phone. Then I scrolled up to see the rest of their conversation. What I found made me want to vomit. Ashley had texted earlier that day. "The lawyer says we need her to sign the power of attorney before we can move forward with anything. Once we have that, we can sell the condo and get her settled at Sunset Manor without any more drama." Daniel had replied, "I know, but she's being stubborn about it. Maybe we need to speed up the timeline, get her more confused and overwhelmed so she'll be grateful for our help. Speed up the timeline, get her more confused and overwhelmed." They were planning to deliberately stress me out and make me feel incompetent so I'd be easier to manipulate. I kept scrolling, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Ashley. The financial advisor I talked to said her portfolio is worth way more than we thought. With the condo sale and her investments and the life insurance money she never spent, We're looking at close to $800,000 total. Daniel, that's enough to pay off all our debt and still have plenty left over for the business. We just need to get through the next few weeks without her figuring out what's happening. The business. They weren't just planning to steal my money to pay their bills. They were planning to use it to start some kind of business. They were going to ruin my life to fund their dreams. But the worst message was yet to come. Daniel, I found the assisted living place that takes Medicaid patients. Once her money runs out from paying our debts, Medicaid will cover the rest. She'll never know the difference. Ashley, perfect. How long do you think $800,000 will last if we're smart about it? Daniel, the way I figure it, if we put her in the cheapest place we can find and manage her money carefully, we can stretch it for maybe 10 years. By then, either Medicaid kicks in or, well, or I'd be dead. That's what he meant. They were planning to slowly drain my life savings while keeping me locked up in the cheapest nursing home they could find. And they were hoping I'd die before the money ran out and their plan was exposed. I heard the toilet flush upstairs and quickly put Daniel's phone back exactly where he'd left it. When he came back down to the kitchen, I was sitting at my table with my hands folded, looking like a confused old lady who was ready to accept help from her loving son. Mom, Daniel sat down across from me, putting on his most caring expression. I know this is all overwhelming for you. Maybe we should talk about getting you some help with managing your affairs, just temporarily, until you feel more confident about handling everything. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a complete stranger. This wasn't the little boy I'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms. This wasn't the teenager I'd helped with homework. This wasn't even the young man I'd supported through college. This was a predator who had identified me as his target and was moving in for the kill. What kind of help, Daniel? Well, there's this legal document called a power of attorney. It would let me handle your bills and your banking, just until you feel more comfortable with everything. It doesn't mean you can't make your own decisions. It just means I can help you when things get complicated. A power of attorney. The key to everything. Once I signed that piece of paper, Daniel would have complete control over my finances. He could sell my home, empty my bank accounts, and commit me to whatever facility he wanted, all while claiming he was acting in my best interests. That sounds helpful, I said slowly. Do you have those papers with you? Daniel's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Actually, yes. I picked them up from a lawyer earlier this week, just in case you were interested in exploring the option. Just in case. He'd been carrying around power of attorney documents, waiting for the right moment to spring them on me. He pulled a manila envelope from his jacket pocket and spread the papers out on my kitchen table. They were already filled out with my information, just waiting for my signature. At the bottom of the page, I could see where it said Principal with a line for my signature and Agent with Daniel's name already typed in. I just need to read through this carefully, I said, picking up the papers. You know how I am with legal documents. Of course, Mom. Take your time. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched in his lap. He wanted that signature badly. I pretended to read while my mind raced. I needed to buy time to figure out my next move. I needed to get him out of my apartment so I could think clearly. And most importantly, I needed to make sure I never, ever signed those papers. Daniel, this is a lot to process. Can I think about it overnight and give you an answer tomorrow? I could see the frustration flash across his face before he covered it with fake understanding. Sure, Mom. But remember, every day we delay is a day that you're vulnerable. If something happened to you tonight, a fall, a medical emergency, we'd have no way to help you manage your affairs. Vulnerable. The same woman who'd been managing her own affairs for 50 years was suddenly vulnerable and needed her unemployed son to take care of her. After Daniel left, I sat in my kitchen and stared at those power of attorney papers. They were so innocent looking, just a few pages of legal text. But they represented the complete destruction of my independence, my autonomy, my right to control my own life. I called Patricia again. Maggie, you need to get out of there, she said after I told her about the nursing home deposit and the text messages. Pack a bag and come to Chicago tonight. We can figure out what to do from here. Patricia, I can't run away from this. This is my home, my life. If I leave now, they'll probably claim I'm having some kind of mental breakdown and use that as evidence that I can't take care of myself. Then what are you going to do? I looked around my kitchen, at the table where I'd eaten thousands of meals, at the window where I watched the sunrise every morning with my coffee, at the pictures on my refrigerator of happier times with Daniel when he was still my son instead of my enemy. I'm going to fight back. The next morning, I started making phone calls. First, I called Janet at the bank and moved all of my money to a different institution across town. Then, I called my insurance agent and changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy from Daniel to Patricia. Then I called my attorney, the same one who'd handled Roberto's estate, and made an emergency appointment. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, no relation to my neighbor Elena, had been practicing elder law for 23 years. When I showed him the power of attorney papers and told him about the text messages I'd photographed, his expression grew grim. Mrs. Santos, what you're describing is a textbook case of elder financial abuse with intent to commit guardianship fraud. If they'd succeeded in getting you to sign these papers, they could have destroyed your life legally, and there would have been very little recourse. What do I do now? Now, we set a trap. Michael explained that the best way to protect myself was to gather more evidence of their plan while building legal safeguards they couldn't overcome. He helped me draft a new will that specifically disinherited Daniel due to his attempts at financial exploitation. He arranged for a comprehensive mental health evaluation to legally document my competency. And most importantly, he helped me plan exactly what to say and do when Daniel came back for my signature on those papers. The key, Michael told me, is to make them think they're winning right up until the moment you reveal that you've known about their plan all along. Predators like this are often so confident in their own intelligence that they can't imagine their victim outsmarting them. That afternoon, I drove to Sunset Manor to see exactly where Daniel and Ashley had planned to warehouse me. It was in Homestead, about 45 minutes from my neighborhood, in a rundown strip of buildings between a tire shop and a payday loan place. The smell of disinfectant and despair hit me the moment I walked through the front door. The activity room had 6 elderly people sitting in wheelchairs, staring at a television that was too loud. The hallways were painted institutional green and lit with harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. The dining room had long tables with plastic chairs and the kind of cafeteria trays I remembered from elementary school. This was where they wanted to put me. This was their idea of appropriate care for a woman who'd spent her whole life working to avoid ending up in exactly this kind of place. I asked to speak with the admissions coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Beverly, who seemed surprised to see someone inquiring about their own potential residency. "Oh yes, Mrs. Santos," Beverly said when I gave her my name. "Your son and daughter-in-law were here just last week. Such a caring couple, so concerned about making sure you have the support you need. They put down a $500 deposit to hold a spot in our memory care unit." Memory care unit. They hadn't just planned to put me in assisted living. They'd told the nursing home that I had dementia. "Memory care?" I asked. "What made them think I needed memory care?" Beverly looked confused. "Well, your son explained that you'd been having some difficulties with confusion and decision-making. He said the family was concerned about your safety living alone." I thanked Beverly and left, my rage building with every step toward my car. They'd not only stolen my mail, hired a real estate agent, and picked out a nursing home. They'd lied to the nursing home staff and put me in a section for people with dementia. Once I was locked up in there, labeled as mentally incompetent, who would listen if I tried to tell anyone I'd been kidnapped by my own family? But I wasn't done discovering the depths of their betrayal. That evening, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I drove to Daniel and Ashley's apartment building and waited in the parking lot. At 8:30, Ashley came out alone, dressed up and carrying a small overnight bag. She got into her car and drove to the Marriott downtown, where she met a man who definitely wasn't my son. I sat in my car in the hotel parking lot and watched Ashley kiss this stranger like he was the love of her life before they went upstairs together. She was cheating on Daniel while they planned to steal my money together. The perfect partnership of greed and betrayal. I drove home that night with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. These people, I couldn't even think of them as family anymore, weren't just stealing my money. They were stealing my dignity, my independence, my right to live my life on my own terms. They'd planned every detail of my destruction while pretending to love and care about me. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that this 68-year-old seamstress had spent her whole life learning how to fix things that were broken. And I was about to show them exactly what happened when someone tried to tear apart something I'd spent my lifetime building. Tomorrow, Daniel would come back for my signature on those power of attorney papers, and I would be ready for him. What happened next would teach both of them that you should never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Comment below and tell me what you think I should do, because the confrontation that was coming would change all of our lives forever. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 and spent an hour preparing for what would either be the most satisfying day of my life or the beginning of a legal nightmare. I made my coffee, read my morning prayers, and laid out everything I needed on my kitchen table like I was preparing for surgery. The original power of attorney papers Daniel had left with me were in a manila folder on the left side of the table. Next to them, I placed the new legal documents my attorney Michael had prepared: a revocation of any previous power of attorney attempts, a restraining order application, and a formal complaint for elder financial abuse. My phone was positioned perfectly to record everything that was about to happen. At exactly 9 o'clock, Daniel knocked on my door. He was dressed in his best suit, the one I'd bought him for job interviews 3 years ago, and carrying a small gift bag from a fancy department store. "Good morning, Mom," he said, giving me a kiss on the cheek that felt like a snake striking. "I brought you some of that lavender tea you like." Lavender tea. I hate lavender tea. I've always hated lavender tea. But Daniel had never paid enough attention to notice. "That's so thoughtful, sweetheart. Come in, come in." He followed me to the kitchen, and I could see his eyes immediately go to the power of attorney papers still spread out on the table. The relief that flashed across his face was disgusting. "I see you've been reading through the documents," he said, sitting down in the same chair where he'd announced his plan to steal my life just a week earlier. "Oh yes, I read every word, very carefully." I poured him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "Daniel, I have some questions." "Of course, Mom. I want you to feel completely comfortable with this." I picked up the first page of the power of attorney. It says here that you would have the authority to make decisions about my living situation. What exactly does that mean? Daniel's smile was so fake it hurt to look at. "It just means that if you ever needed additional care or support, I could help arrange that for you. Nothing would change unless it was absolutely necessary for your safety." "I see. And what about this part about managing my investments and bank accounts?" "That's just so I can help with bill paying, make sure everything gets handled properly. You wouldn't have to worry about any of that complicated financial stuff anymore." Complicated financial stuff. The same financial stuff I'd been handling successfully for 50 years. "Daniel," I said, setting down the papers and looking him directly in the eyes, "I need you to tell me something honestly. Do you think I'm losing my mind?" He looked genuinely surprised by the question. "What?" "No, Mom, of course not. You're sharp as ever. This isn't about your mental capacity. This is about convenience and planning ahead." "Good. I'm glad you think I'm still sharp, because a sharp woman might notice if someone was, for example, stealing her mail." The color drained from Daniel's face. "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about." I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "I'm talking about this." I dumped the contents on the table: bank statements, investment reports, insurance documents, all opened and obviously handled. "I found these in Ashley's car yesterday when I saw her at the hotel with her boyfriend." Daniel's mouth fell open. "Her what?" "Oh, you didn't know about Ashley's friend Marcus? Tall, dark hair, drives a BMW? She's been meeting him at the Marriott downtown twice a week for the past month. I have pictures." I slid my phone across the table, showing him the photos I'd taken the night before. Ashley kissing another man, getting into the hotel elevator with him, coming out the next morning wearing the same clothes from the night before. Daniel stared at the phone like it was a bomb that had just exploded in his hands. This can't be real." "Oh, it's very real, Daniel. Just like the text messages on your phone about putting me in Sunset Manor's memory care unit. Just like the real estate agent you hired without my permission. Just like the deposit you put down to warehouse me in that horrible place." Now Daniel was truly panicking. "Mom, I can explain all of that. You're taking everything out of context." "Am I? Let me see if I understand the context correctly. I stood up and walked to my kitchen drawer, the same drawer where I keep all my important documents. You and Ashley have been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, steal my power of attorney, sell my home, and use the money to pay off your debts and start a business. The plan was to keep me locked up in the cheapest nursing home you could find until my money ran out or I died, whichever came first. Does that sound about right? Daniel shot to his feet. Mom, you don't understand. We're in serious trouble here. Ashley and I owe over $80,000 in credit cards and loans. I lost my job. We're going to lose everything if we don't figure something out. So you figured you'd solve your problems by stealing from your mother? It's not stealing, he shouted, and for the first time, I saw the real Daniel, not the manipulative schemer, but the desperate, angry man who thought the world owed him something. It's your money now, but it's going to be my money eventually anyway. I'm just trying to access it while you're still alive, to see me benefit from it. While I'm still alive, to see him benefit from it. Like he was doing me a favor by stealing from me before I died. Daniel, I said very quietly, opening my kitchen drawer, I want you to see something. I pulled out a sealed envelope and placed it on the table in front of him. This is a copy of my new will, which I had executed yesterday morning. Would you like to know what it says? His hands were shaking as he reached for the envelope. Mom, what did you do? I left everything, my condo, my investments, my life insurance, all of it, to Patricia. You and Ashley get nothing. $0 and 0 cents. Daniel tore open the envelope and read the first page of the will. The blood drained from his face as he saw his name listed under parties specifically excluded from inheritance due to attempted financial exploitation. You can't do this, he whispered. Actually, I can. I also moved all of my money to a bank you've never heard of. I changed the beneficiary on my life insurance, and I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office for elder financial abuse. I reached back into the drawer and pulled out another envelope. This is a copy of the restraining order I'll be filing this afternoon, which will prevent you from coming within 500 feet of my home or contacting me in any way. Daniel was staring at the papers like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mom, you're making a huge mistake. You need me. You need someone to take care of you. I've been taking care of myself since before you were born, Daniel. I don't need anyone who thinks lying and stealing is an acceptable way to solve their problems. But the money you planned to steal from me? Consider it gone forever. I walked to my front door and held it open. You have 5 minutes to get out of my apartment before I call the police. Mom, please, you have to listen to me. Ashley and I can explain everything. This has all been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding here is how badly I failed as a mother if I raised a son who thought he could rob his own family. Daniel tried one more time, the desperation making his voice crack. What about when you get older? What about when you really do need help? I looked at this man who had once been my baby, my little boy, my pride and joy. When that time comes, Daniel, I'll hire people to help me. People I can trust. People who won't steal from me while pretending to love me. He stood there for a moment longer, and I could see him trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage his plan. But the look in my eyes must have told him the truth. This was over, and he had lost completely. You'll regret this, he said as he walked toward the door. When you're sitting alone in some nursing home with no family to visit you, you'll regret this. Daniel, I said as he reached the hallway. I'd rather sit alone in a nursing home than sit anywhere with people who tried to put me there so they could steal my money. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, then leaned against it and listened to his footsteps disappearing down the hallway. 3 hours later, Patricia called to tell me that Daniel had tried to contact her, asking if she knew what Mom was going through, and suggesting that I might be having some kind of breakdown. Patricia told him exactly what she thought of his scheme, and hung up on him. 6 months later, I'm still living peacefully in my condo. Daniel sends me text messages every few weeks, usually when he needs money, but I don't respond. Ashley left him 2 months after our confrontation, taking half of what little they had left and moving in with Marcus full-time. I learned that my son was willing to destroy my life to solve his problems. But I also learned that I was stronger than I ever imagined, and that it's never too late to fight back against people who try to take advantage of your love. The drawer they thought contained the key to stealing my life actually contained the key to protecting it. And sometimes the biggest favor you can do for someone is to show them there are consequences for their choices. If this story touched your heart, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message about standing up for themselves and never accepting abuse from anyone, even family. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories of overcoming difficult family situations, and watch now the story that's playing on your screen about another person who refused to let family members take advantage of their kindness.